Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in a time unlike any other where history, prophecy, and human responsibility are colliding in ways that demand our attention. What if I told you that August 2025 isn't just another date on the calendar, but a divinely marked moment, a signal, a shift, a sign that the next chapter in the biblical timeline is already unfolding? Tonight, we're not here to steer fear. We're here to awaken purpose. Because the signs are real, the shaking has begun, and the question now is not if you're ready, but how you will respond. We are living in a moment where history no longer feels like a slow progression of time, but rather a series of rapid, accelerating shifts. Politically, socially, psychologically, and spiritually, people feel it. Whether they can articulate it or not, there's an undercurrent of anxiety, a collective anticipation, as if something beneath the surface is about to break through. Now you can dismiss that as mass hysteria or cultural paranoia, but I believe that would be intellectually lazy. We must take seriously the psychological weight of history and the metaphysical patterns that have preceded societal transformation in the past. And as we step into August 2025, we are entering a period that demands our attention, not because of superstition, but because of converging signs that echo ancient prophetic patterns. Throughout the biblical narrative, time is never random. It's not just a linear march forward. Time, as presented in the scriptures, is cyclical, woven with appointed moments, what the Hebrew tradition calls mudim. These are not arbitrary. They're sacred windows when divine intervention touches human history. And whenever God moved decisively, whether to bless, to warn, or to judge, it was always in alignment with these appointed times. August 2025, if we are paying attention, aligns with several historical and prophetic convergences that suggest something is coming. Something that is not merely political or environmental, but deeply spiritual. Let's strip away the mysticism for a moment. What we're dealing with here is pattern recognition, the ability to see repeating themes over time and interpret what they mean. This is something we do in psychology, philosophy, and even in science. The problem is, in the secular world, we've abandoned the language of prophecy because we think it's irrational. But prophecy, properly understood, is not fortune-telling. It's the articulation of timeless truths embedded in the fabric of existence. Truths that repeat, resurface, and demand our response. When you examine global events through this lens, August 2025 becomes more than just a date. Economically, we're witnessing instability on a scale we haven't seen in decades. Culturally, moral foundations are eroding at an accelerated pace. Spiritually, there's a hunger and a confusion growing side by side. And then there are the celestial alignments. Solar activity, lunar cycles, planetary shifts, all echoing the same pattern that was present during previous biblical turning points. This doesn't mean we worship the stars. It means we observe them as God's timekeepers, just as Genesis said they would be big for signs and for seasons. In ancient times, when a prophet spoke of an appointed time, they weren't merely referring to the calendar. They were pointing to a psychological moment, a tipping point in human behavior when the collective conscience either turns toward truth or descends further into chaos. That's what I believe we're approaching now, a moment when the world will be confronted with a choice between clarity and confusion, between meaning and nihilism, between God and the gods of the age. And the terrifying thing is, we may not recognize that choice when it comes because it won't arrive as a headline. It will arrive in the subtleties of conscience, in the silence of the soul. That's why we must be awake. Not just emotionally stirred, but intellectually prepared, spiritually grounded, philosophically equipped. Because when the moment arrives, and I believe August 200, 2025 is one of those moments, it won't just shake governments or economies. It will test every individual's ability to perceive truth, to endure uncertainty, and to respond with moral courage. The appointed time is not just about what God is doing. It's about whether we're ready to recognize it when it comes. And that's the uncomfortable truth. The future doesn't just happen to us. It emerges from what we fail to notice and what we choose to ignore. Now let's take this a step further, because it's not enough to say that something is coming. That's abstract. It doesn't move people. What matters is the reality that something has already begun. That's what many miss. This idea that prophecy is always far off, always somewhere in the distance. But biblically speaking, signs are not just warnings of what will come. They are often the beginning of what's already unfolding. The storm doesn't start with thunder. It starts with the pressure change you can't see but can feel if you're attuned to it. And in that sense, the next biblical sign isn't just on the horizon. It's already manifesting right in front of us. Think about this psychologically. Human beings are not built to process large-scale change all at once. We notice it in fragments, in shifts in behavior, language, mood, and energy. We feel the edge of something new before we can define it. And that's exactly how spiritual signs tend to work. They're not always loud. Often, they whisper through events we dismiss as coincidence. But when we start seeing the same themes repeated across different domains, personal crises, institutional breakdowns, natural disasters, moral confusion, we're no longer dealing with isolated events. We're staring at the emergence of a pattern. And in biblical language, that pattern is called a sign. A sign, philosophically, is not just a symbol. It's a signal. Something that demands interpretation and invites responsibility. It tells you that meaning is present beneath the surface, even if it isn't immediately obvious. The challenge is that we live in a culture trained to see everything through a material lens. We no longer ask, what does this mean? We only ask, what caused it? And in doing so, we cut ourselves off from the deeper dimension of reality, the moral and spiritual logic that undergirds existence. Let's talk specifics. The increase in geopolitical tension, particularly involving Israel and the Middle East, should not be viewed as just another political flare-up. It mirrors prophetic language laid out in Ezekiel and Revelation, language that frames Israel not just as a nation, but as a spiritual timepiece. The rise in anti-Semitism, the polarizing of nations, the fragile global alliances, these aren't random. They're part of a larger unfolding narrative. Add to that the intensification of natural disasters, earthquakes, fires, floods, all growing in frequency and scale. Now, of course, we can talk about climate change, and perhaps that's part of it. But if that's all we see, we miss the existential weight behind it. Because in every civilization throughout history, when the natural world began to shake, it was interpreted not just as a physical threat, but as a divine message. Pay attention. The same applies to the psychological and moral disintegration we see all around us, especially in the West. The rejection of identity, the collapse of objective truth, the rise of spiritual apathy, all of these point to a civilization losing its anchor. And when a culture severs itself from truth, it becomes incapable of reading the signs. That's when darkness spreads, not because the light vanished, but because no one is willing to face it anymore. So when I say the next sign is already here, I don't mean a single event. I mean a sequence of moments stacking like dominoes, leading us toward a spiritual crossroads. And if we wait until it's unmistakably clear, it will already be too late to respond meaningfully. The sign is the warning, but it's also the invitation to return, to awaken, to align our lives with something higher. This is where responsibility comes in. If you see the signs and choose to ignore them, that's not neutrality. That's complicity. because meaning seen but not acted upon leads to decay individually and collectively. So once we recognize the pattern, once we understand that we're not just living through political change or environmental crisis or cultural instability, but through a moment that carries prophetic and moral weight, the question becomes deeply personal: what now? What do we do with this knowledge? Because awareness without responsibility is just anxiety. It doesn't transform, it paralyzes. And that's exactly where many people are today: overwhelmed, overstimulated, and unsure of what action actually means anymore. The truth is, when the world starts to shake, whether economically, politically, spiritually, or psychologically, the natural human tendency is to look outward. We blame institutions, governments, ideologies. And while those critiques might be valid, they're not sufficient, because the shaking ultimately reveals what we've built our lives on. It exposes the foundations. And if those foundations are built on comfort, distraction, or cultural approval, they will not hold. So preparation, real preparation, is not about survival gear or stockpiles. It's about internal structure, about fortifying the soul. That requires honesty, brutal honesty. We need to ask ourselves, what are the habits I've tolerated that are slowly eroding my clarity? What compromises have I made that numb my conscience? Because the shaking reveals, but it also purifies. And if we engage it willingly, it becomes a kind of moral fire, a refining process that burns away the superficial and leaves behind only what's essential. And what's essential fundamentally is alignment. Not alignment with ideology or tribe, but alignment with truth. And truth is not merely conceptual, it's lived, it's practiced in the mundane and the daily. You prepare for a prophetic season not by understanding every detail of what might come, but by becoming the kind of person who can stand when it does. That means discipline. It means setting your house in order. Mentally, morally, spiritually. It means being rooted in something deeper than public opinion or emotional reaction. And that is extraordinarily difficult in a time like this, when everything is built to keep us passive. Passive in thought, passive in faith, passive in action. Our culture rewards distraction and punishes conviction. But the shaking will demand the exact opposite. It will require clarity, resilience, and moral courage. And it's not just about surviving. That's not the goal. The goal is influence, transformation, becoming the kind of person who doesn't just endure chaos, but who brings order into it. That's the biblical model. Noah didn't just survive the flood. He built the ark that preserved life. Joseph didn't just interpret Pharaoh's dream. He structured an economy that saved nations. Esther didn't just avoid danger. She stepped into it for the sake of others. The prophetic call is not a call to escape. It's a call to rise. And if we miss that, if we reduce all of this to fear or paranoia, we miss the very purpose of the sign. God never reveals what is coming to terrify. He reveals it to prepare, to purify, and ultimately to empower those who will listen. So what does preparation look like for you? Maybe it means confronting a destructive pattern in your life. Maybe it means stepping into a leadership role you've been avoiding. Maybe it's time to re-evaluate your moral compass, your spiritual routine, your capacity to stand for what matters when it costs you something. Because whether you realize it or not, you're being shaped right now, every day, every decision. And in a time of shaking, the small choices compound into your legacy. The shaking is not just testing the world, it's testing you. So don't just brace for impact. Become the kind of person who others will look to when the impact comes.